When two young women began a feud over the same guy, the arguments and the threats were a two-way street. No one expected them to amount to anything until they did. And this teenage feud turned into a test of Florida's stand your ground law. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. As you may have noticed, if you're a keen observer of my schedule or you at least follow me on social media, you know that there was no episode last week. Usually I release episodes on the first, third, and fourth weeks of the month, and I just take the second week off. But this time I took the first week off, and that's because this case required more time than I had allotted it, so I shuffled things around because I'd rather take a little longer with something than give it a superficial treatment. Sometimes episodes take longer because they're long episodes, like the recent two-parter on the murder of Carol Kennedy. But some, like this one, aren't necessarily super long, but there was just so much information to go over. The trial was televised, and it's actually still available on the Court TV website, which is listed in my sources. But the depositions prior to trial and a number of witness statements from different hearings are also available, or at least the transcripts are, and those are on the county court website, also linked in my sources. Because I like details, I ended up reading and watching almost everything I could find, even though it was mostly redundant. One day I will find that intersection of efficiency and thoroughness, but until then, I will just keep making my show the way I make it, and sometimes we'll have to be flexible in the schedule. I do want to give a bit of a language warning on this episode. I can't avoid swearing entirely when I'm quoting a few important statements, though I'm going to temper the worst of it. Let's go ahead and get started with Sarah Ludemann, who was born on December 7th, 1990. Her birth was very much celebrated by her entire family because her father, Charlie, and her mother, Gay, had been married for 15 years before they found out that Gay was pregnant with Sarah. It seemed like a miracle to them because it had been so many years without a baby, and then suddenly, when they hardly expected it, there she was. Sarah grew up in Pinellas Park, Florida, which is in the Tampa-St. Petersburg area. Her parents had moved down there from New York to get away from those harsh winters, and they loved it. As an only child, Sarah was close to both of her parents. She loved to go with her dad in his cab, singing along to the radio. Even through middle school, Sarah's weekend plans would be to study and then watch a movie with her dad, or maybe go to a sleepover with a friend. Some of her friends had their first boyfriends before high school, but Sarah didn't. She had crushes and everything, but really nothing more than that. In Pinellas County schools, where Sarah went, they have a number of career programs at the high school level, and if you wanted to attend one of those specialized programs, you had to go to that specific high school. So Sarah attended a veterinary medicine program at a high school 40 minutes away from her house. And that's 40 minutes if you just drive straight there because she took the bus, and with all those stops, it actually took her over an hour each way. In the summer of 2000, Sarah finished her 10th grade year and was enjoying her school break with friends. One day while they were eating lunch at a Chick-fil-A fast food restaurant, Sarah met a guy working there named Josh Camacho. Josh was a grade ahead of Sarah, but he attended the local Pinellas Park High School, so they had never met before. Sarah was 16 at this point, and she never had a boyfriend, and Josh started showing her some flirtatious attention. According to her friends, she really fell for him. The two started hanging out that summer, doing a bit of unofficial dating, and with this blossoming relationship, Sarah told her parents that she changed her mind about the school she was attending. She wanted to transfer to the nearby Pinellas Park High School, which happened to be where Josh went. Sarah told her parents that she was rethinking becoming a veterinarian, which wasn't untrue, and the 2-hour round-trip bus ride to school was not worth it if she wasn't sure about her career path, which was also true. But it seems from the reporting that she didn't exactly tell them that the boy she liked was at Pinellas Park High, and that certainly influenced her decision. According to Sarah's friend Amber, Josh barely acknowledged her when school started, which was upsetting to Sarah, who thought this was the boy she would be dating. Even more confusing to her was that he treated her a lot differently in private. Even after they started officially dating in November of 2007, The public-private thing continued. In private, he was affectionate, but in public, he didn't want to hold hands or really acknowledge that they were together. There could be a couple of reasons for this. For one thing, Josh did try to put up a tough guy image at school, and maybe Sarah was just too clean cut for him and he was worried how it would impact his image. The other reason, and probably the more important one here, was that Sarah was not his only girlfriend. Josh was seeing at least 2 other girls during the time he was talking to and or dating Sarah, so starting in the summer of 2007 until the spring of 2009. One of Josh's other girlfriends was a young woman named Erin, who was also pregnant with his child when he and Sarah started officially dating. The other girl was named Rachel, and she was someone Josh had known since elementary school. At first, these young women all thought they were Josh's girlfriend, as in sole girlfriend. If they heard about the other one, Josh would assure them that that relationship was old news, and he kind of bounced between the 3, though with Erin it was a little less so. It seems he spent most of his time when he wasn't with Sarah with Rachel. Rachel Wade grew up not very far from Sarah's house and was just a grade ahead of her, but they had never met since they went to different schools. Rachel first met Josh Camacho when his family moved to Pinellas Park when he and Rachel were in the 4th grade. They ended up going to different middle schools, so they lost touch for a number of years. Erin had actually been in the same 4th grade class as them, and she was also friends with both of them back then. She and Josh started dating in high school. Rachel attended the same high school as Josh and Erin, but not for very long. Once a happy child who loved reading, Rachel started hating school, and she started hating her parents' rules. She wanted to do what she saw all the kids with permissive parents doing. She was very social, and she wanted to be out without a curfew and be allowed to go to parties. She didn't want to miss any of the fun, even when she was just 14 and 15 years old. Strong-willed, Rachel started arguing with her parents, and when she couldn't wear them down, she would just sneak out of the house. And sometimes she would stay out, refusing to come home and being classified a chronic runaway. When Rachel was 15, things really came to a head. They were about as bad as they ever were. One time, the police came to the house due to a heated and loud verbal argument with her father over her curfew. Another time they came because while Rachel and her mom were fighting while cooking dinner, Rachel grabbed a knife and locked herself in the bathroom with it. Rachel later said she was just being dramatic and over the top, and that she didn't really intend to hurt herself or anyone else, but I think this just illustrates how volatile things were. There was another time that the police got involved, and that's when 15-year-old Rachel was found in the car with a 19-year-old, and he ended up charged with some type of sex offense. Her parents were really at the end of their rope with her behavior, and they ended up in family counseling, which helped in some ways. Rachel stopped seeing her parents as the enemies, but she wasn't exactly ready to live under their rules. So she dropped out of school, got a job, and moved into an apartment with a friend at the age of 16. Moving out that young meant Rachel was going to struggle, but it did help improve her relationship with her parents. And eventually, she even got her GED. While Josh was dating Sarah, he bumped into Rachel at a party and they reconnected. As far as Rachel was told, Sarah was Josh's ex-girlfriend. And Josh did his best to keep the 3 women in his life separate, but it wouldn't last forever. On February 21st, 2008, Josh and Sarah went to the movies where they bumped into Erin. At this point, she was 8 months pregnant with Josh's son, and had no idea he was dating someone else. According to a police report that was filed, an argument broke out where Josh yelled at Erin and then Erin pushed him. And then paths crossed with Sarah and Rachel in the spring of 2008 when Sarah posted a picture of her and Josh at the beach on her MySpace page. The picture made it clear that they were more than just friends. Rachel Wade saw the picture at the time that she thought she and Josh were exclusive. When Rachel found out about Sarah, she and Josh got into an argument and broke up. This wouldn't be the first or last time that happened. She would catch Josh dating another girl, they would break up, and then eventually get back together. And though Josh thought that he could handle dating multiple people when he wanted, he reportedly got very upset when he found out that after they broke up one of these times, Rachel started dating another guy named Javier. Javier said Josh started blowing up Rachel's phone, saying that he couldn't believe she was seeing someone else. Another time, when they broke up because Josh was with his child's mother, Erin, he told Rachel that if she really cared about him, she wouldn't have given up so easily. She would have fought Erin to keep him. Much to Rachel's friends' dismay, Josh always managed to make his way back into her life. Obviously, they didn't like him because they knew he was a cheater, but they also thought he was a user. Rachel had an apartment with no parental supervision or younger siblings around. She had a car, and she had money coming in from working full-time. Josh was interested in leveraging all of those things because he, according to their friends, had none of that. After Josh finished high school, he was still living at home with his parents and several siblings. He worked off and on, but reportedly he was mostly unemployed. He did have a child that he saw sometimes but didn't financially support, and it doesn't sound like he had his own vehicle either. Every story of him being in a car involves someone else driving him around. So from the point of view of Rachel's friends, Josh was using her for whatever he could get out of her, but beyond that, he was also controlling. He could do whatever he wanted, but he'd get mad if he saw Rachel wearing anything even remotely revealing or going somewhere he didn't want her to go, or if she was busy when he wanted to hang out. And Sarah's friends reported that Josh was the same with her. She generally wore shorts year-round, which is not uncommon in the Tampa area, but then she started wearing pants because, according to Sarah, Josh didn't want other guys looking at her legs. Sarah's friends said Josh also expected her to be at his beck and call. There were times Sarah wouldn't go out because she was at home waiting to see if Josh needed her. Josh would later discount this, claiming that both women knew that they were not in an exclusive relationship and that they were all open to do whatever they wanted. His mother also said that the way her son has been portrayed in all of this is inaccurate, but I can't discount that multiple people who knew Rachel and multiple people who knew Sarah told the same stories about Josh. I think the context we need to keep in mind here as we go into everything that happened next is how young everyone involved was. Sarah was 17 to 18 during the worst parts of this, and Rachel and Josh were 18 to 19. None of them could even legally buy beer in the United States. They were all so young and navigating their relationships with so much impulsivity and so little frontal lobe involvement. Now, that context is not an excuse for anyone's behavior, not Josh, Sarah, or Rachel, but it is something to keep in mind. What you may wonder is where the adults were. Where were the parents? And at least in Sarah's case, they were right there. But Sarah's parents were smart. They knew the score. Parents getting in between their teen child and the person they think they love is not a winning position. If they forbid her from seeing her first true love, it would only cause more issues. They didn't want Sarah to cut them off from information about her life, and particularly information on her relationship with Josh. So they tried to get to know him. Her dad would take him out to do things, they'd invite him over for dinner, and they tried to include Josh in the family rather than exclude him in the hopes that it wouldn't cause Sarah to pull away. They did not ignore his bad behavior. Her dad referred to him as the rat, after all, but they didn't try to force Sarah to cut him off. And in that regard, it did work as far as keeping the relationship between Sarah and her parents intact. But it didn't help make her relationship with Josh more stable or less toxic. Sarah was madly in love with Josh, and he seemed to consume her. She was scared he would leave her for one of those other women in his life, and that led to Sarah acting in ways people had never seen from her before. Some of this took place not in person, but on social media. Rachel and Sarah were both active on MySpace, and they would post pictures of themselves and Josh, not just for their friends, but definitely for the other one to see. On June 17th, 2008, after seeing photos Sarah posted making it clear that she and Josh were together, Rachel updated her MySpace to say, "When we first met, I was madly in love, but since then things have changed. You called me names, you slept around. I deserve so much better." Sarah then commented on this, essentially letting Rachel know that it was Josh who had found something better. Rachel then commented on a picture of Sarah, calling her fat. And though the MySpace drama and back and forth was between the two of them, Erin was still in the mix here in real life. She was the mother of Josh's child, and neither Rachel nor Sarah felt entirely confident that when Josh said he was spending time with his son, that didn't also mean he was sleeping with Erin. So on July 2nd, 2008, Sarah was so sure that Erin and Josh were together that she drove to Erin's house to confront them. But he actually wasn't there. So together, Erin and Sarah decided to go find Josh, and they followed him as he drove around with a friend. Josh and his friend realized they were being followed, so the friend stopped the car and Josh got out. He went over to Sarah's side of the car and she rolled down the window or maybe opened the door, and that's when, according to Sarah, Josh punched her. According to Josh, he did push the car door closed and maybe it hit somebody's leg, but Josh said it wasn't until he called the cops to report that they were following him that they claimed Josh had hit anyone. This is the only documented incident of physical violence between the two, though there were other accusations. And though the police were called and Sarah's parents urged her to press charges, she wouldn't go through with it. Charging Josh with battery was likely the end of their relationship, and Sarah still didn't want that to happen, even with everything else going on. This wasn't the start or the end to the police interactions due to her relationship with Josh, but the next one didn't involve Josh directly. It was between Sarah and Rachel. On July 31st, 2008, Rachel and her friend Courtney had worked at the Applebee's restaurant until close, and they were hanging out after. They were at a nearby Taco Bell parking lot around 2:30 a.m., and they were in Courtney's car talking. Another car pulled up, and 3 girls got out, one of them being Sarah. The 3 had silly string, and they sprayed it all over Courtney's car before getting back into their car and driving off. There's a little discrepancy in the accounts on this, and the car Sarah was in may or may not have bumped into Courtney's car in that parking lot. Regardless, Courtney pulled out behind the car Sarah was in, while Rachel called the police to report the incident. Courtney later said they were following the car so they could get the license plate for the police. At some point, the car in front stopped, and all 3 women got out again. According to Courtney, Sarah ran up to the car screaming, and Rachel was in the passenger seat with her window rolled up, but Courtney in the driver's seat had her window rolled down. One of the teens, who was not Sarah, reached through the open window and hit Courtney. Another one of the girls, who also was not Sarah, banged on the car. The police dispatcher, who was still on the line, told the girls to roll up the windows, lock the doors, and just stay where they were. Everyone was still at the scene when the police arrived, and they took the statements and talked to Courtney. They told her she could press charges for the battery, but it would mean showing up at court, and according to Courtney, the cop basically said it would be easier if they all just went home. Courtney agreed, even though she had been hit and there was a dent on her car, either from the other car hitting it or from the one girl banging on it. The police waited for both cars to leave in different directions, and the matter was dropped. Another time that Sarah had police contact was about a month after this in late August 2008. Sarah called to report that Rachel was harassing her, calling her 20 times in 2 hours and leaving multiple threatening messages. She said she wanted to have it documented just in case Rachel went through with her threats and something did happen to her. I'm going to go ahead and play an example of the messages she was leaving. I have beeped out the curse words. Well, I silenced them because beeps are annoying, and I have no idea why people still use them in the age of the earbud. Maybe I'm just a big baby about things beeping in my ear, but whatever. The reason I'm playing it is because I think hearing her tone of voice is important here.
Please tell me, Sarah, why you would be a dumb put a brand new picture of you and Josh at the beach. Seriously, I told you to watch your back and not to chill with him. Now your ass is mine, and I'm guaranteeing you I'm no f***ing murder you. I'm letting you know that now. Because you know what? Josh might have played me, but I'm going to play your ass out too. Watch. You're a fat bitch, and I'm going to f***ing kill you. I swear on my life. Watch out your f***ing window when I get off work tonight, you dumb.
Now, if you got a voicemail like this, would you think the person was angry enough to go through with their threats, or were they just trying to sound tough? It seems to me that Sarah wasn't quite sure how to take it because she wanted it documented, but she didn't seek to file charges for harassment or verbal assault. The police did speak to Rachel about this, and she said that Sarah was sending threatening emails and messages as well, and her calls were in retaliation. Now, you would think that run-ins with the police might calm things down, that whole scared straight idea, but it really didn't. Things continued with this back and forth, and it got, as you can tell from that voicemail, very mean. One time, Sarah and her friends went to Applebee's and asked the clueless hostess to sit them in Rachel's section, only to then treat her like crap the whole night, and once even knocked over her tray. And for her part, Rachel put hair in their food and may have even spit in it. It was bad enough that the hostesses learned that if Sarah came in, they would tell her there were no seats in Rachel's section, even if it was wide open, and they would find a spot as far away as possible. All of this rage and anger Sarah and Rachel had for each other didn't seem to land nearly as often on Josh Camacho, the person who was actually at fault. I mean, they would yell at him and get angry, and there were definitely nasty fights, but it wasn't close to what they did to each other. Rachel did not owe Sarah fidelity, and Sarah didn't owe it to Rachel, so why were they taking it out on each other? The truth was that neither of them wanted to hold Josh accountable because they both wanted to be with him. So they blamed the other, and Josh reportedly did very little to ease things. In fact, according to witnesses, he encouraged it by saying things like, "If you loved me, you would fight for me." The question was, how literally did he mean fight? At this point, Sarah and Rachel both tried to sound tough, making threats to each other, warning the other one to stay away from their man, but no physical fighting between the two of them had happened. Aside from silly string, no weapons were involved. And to some degree, that may have given both of them a sense of security as this dragged on for literally months. The threats eventually started to ring hollow for the most part, so neither seemed fazed by them until April 2009, when the threats back and forth were starting to wear on them. At that point, Josh was seeing both Rachel and Sarah. He'd spend most of the afternoon and evening with Sarah while Rachel was at work, and then when Sarah would go home in time for her 11 p.m. curfew, he'd wait for Rachel to get off work at 1 a.m. and sometimes even sleep over there. Josh would later claim that he and Rachel were just friends with benefits, and it was the same with Sarah, and that they both knew that. But there's absolutely nothing, including his own behavior, to support that. So it comes across as a cop-out. Josh was with them in every single way partners are together. They weren't just regular friends who slept together. He went on dates with them. He sent them tons of texts and talked to them on the phone, told them that he loved them, and did all the boyfriend things that one would do. Even his sister said Sarah and Josh were inseparable, going everywhere together. And Rachel's friend said he spent several nights a week at her apartment. These were not casual relationships, no matter what he tried to paint it as later on. And believing that Josh was back with her on April 13th, Rachel put on MySpace that she was, quote, "lovin' my boo." The next day, Tuesday, April 14th, we know Sarah saw that post because she texted Josh about it. At about 1:05 p.m., she texted him that he gets mad at her for everything, but doesn't care when Rachel says something on MySpace designed to hurt her. Shortly after that, she texted that all they fight about is Rachel, and she loved him, but it hurt. Sarah was also upset that he wasn't being as loving towards her, and Josh was about to spend 2 days with, quote, her, and Sarah wrote that she was just going to sit around crying. That text was in regards to Josh spending the weekend with Aaron, though he was really supposed to be there to spend time with his son. He and Aaron were not sleeping together at that point, but Sarah didn't trust him for pretty obvious reasons. When Josh didn't respond to Sarah's text that afternoon, around 6:30, she texted again, and she wrote, quote, "You say you love me, but you don't even have the decency to text me back." They must have spoken on the phone after this because at 8:02 p.m., Josh sent a short text telling Sarah to bring the movies. It didn't make sense in the context of the other texts around it, so it sounds like they spoke on the phone and made plans to get together. So Sarah asked her parents if she could take the minivan with plans to be home for her 11 p.m. school night curfew. She then updated her MySpace mood to say, "I love you, baby," and then she drove over to hang out with Josh at his sister Janet's house. Rachel, in the meantime, had the night off of work with plans to spend that time with Josh. But that day, he kept going back and forth with her in text, initially canceling the plans and then later saying maybe he'd come over late. Rachel probably saw Sarah's MySpace page update and rightfully assumed that they were spending the evening together. So that night, while Josh and Sarah were together, Rachel was texting Josh, and the two got in a little bit of a text argument, with Sarah also arguing with Rachel, initially mostly over text. Josh and Sarah would read the text out to the people who were also hanging out with them, which included Josh's older sister Janet, who wasn't necessarily worried about this argument. She had been observing this drama for about 10 months at that point, and it had always been words and maybe a little silly string. But then, according to Josh and his sister Janet, Rachel parked her car down the street from Janet's house and waited. She sent Josh a text that said, "Now I know why you're not talking to me, because you got her." Josh texted back, "That's right, I don't like you no more. Why are you down the street? Go home." And Rachel replied, "No, I'll wait for her to go home." This was a little bit of a running thing between Sarah and Rachel. Rachel lived on her own and hadn't had a curfew in years, so she would make fun of Sarah for having to run home at the end of the night, kind of a go away little girl thing, as though she was so much older and more mature. But the curfew thing was true, and Sarah's dad texted her to remind her of this curfew, and she said she would be home soon. According to Josh and his sister Janet, the holdup was Rachel. Sarah didn't want to leave while Rachel was out there. According to Janet, Sarah said that Rachel was going to fight her if she went outside, and Janet told her that she was safe as long as she stayed in Janet's house. Rachel would never mess with her since Janet and Rachel had their own issues in the past, and Janet had the upper hand in some type of altercation they had. Eventually, Rachel did drive off, and as Sarah got ready to head home, Janet asked her if she could get a ride to McDonald's on her way. Sarah said sure, she was already an hour past her curfew and a couple minutes out of her way would not be a big deal. The texting between Rachel and Sarah and Josh didn't stop with Rachel leaving, and it escalated to phone calls between Rachel and Sarah. It's not clear who called who first, but witnesses said it was just the two of them yelling back and forth, and then one would hang up, and then the phone would ring again, and either of them could have ended it by simply not answering the phone and not calling the other one back. But again, that frontal lobe that handles executive function is one of the last areas of the brain to mature. When Sarah got into the car with Janet and Janet's friend Jalissa, she put the call on speakerphone. According to Janet and Jalissa, it was hard to really understand much of what either were saying since they were mostly just yelling expletives at each other. But they both later reported hearing Rachel say, quote, "I'm going to wait for you at your house. I'm going to stab you and your Mexican boyfriend," end quote. Janet specifically remembered that line because it was one thing to have them going back and forth with each other, but as a protective older sister, she was not happy to hear her brother being threatened. In response to this, Sarah said something about how she was going to kick Rachel's butt. Sarah was at a stop sign when another friend of hers named Ashley pulled up alongside her. Ashley had just been at Janet's house dropping something off, and so they rolled down their windows to talk to each other. Sarah told Ashley that Rachel was threatening to fight her and that she would be waiting at Sarah's house, and Ashley said Rachel wasn't at her house. She had just seen her a few streets away at the house of Rachel's ex-boyfriend, Javier. Ashley didn't think much about telling Sarah this and certainly didn't anticipate what would come next. Sarah, for whatever reason, decided that instead of going home, knowing Rachel wasn't there, she drove to Javier's. Janet said Sarah drove at a normal speed there, but Jalissa said she sped, taking corners very quickly. When they drove down Javier Street, they saw Rachel's car parked in front of his house, and the noses of their vehicles were facing each other. Rachel was sitting on the hood of her car. Sarah stopped short and opened the door to get out. Before anyone really knew what happened, Sarah and Rachel were locked in a fight where both seemed to be hitting and or flailing, and after about 5 to 10 seconds, it was over. Javier and another friend of his named Dustin had also approached them to try to break it up, but again, it was over almost as quickly as it started. Sarah went back to the driver's seat of the van and sat down while Janet started following Rachel. She noticed Rachel had a knife in her hand, so she took off her flip-flop and tried to hit the knife out of Rachel's hand. I was reading the deposition transcription about this incident, and I actually got confused for a minute because the court reporter taking the deposition wrote that she took off her chunklettos, which first had me picturing like this chunky high heel shoe, but then it occurred to me that what Janet had actually said was her chanclas, and the court reporter just apparently doesn't know that word. Anyway, Javier and Dustin were trying to get Janet to back off and get Rachel up the lawn and into the house to safety. Sarah was yelling that they had to get out of there and said something about Janet's children, which Janet took to mean as she was telling Janet to think of her children and not put herself at risk in a physical fight. Jalissa was distracted by the fight between Janet and Rachel for a bit, so when she looked over at Sarah after she stopped yelling that they had to get out of there, she realized Sarah was on the ground next to the driver's side. Jalissa yelled out that Sarah was hurt, and everyone except Rachel went over to check on Sarah, who was bleeding from her chest. Javier took off his shirt, and Dustin held it to Sarah's wound to try to stop the bleeding while 911 was called. Neither Javier nor Dustin had seen the knife in Rachel's hand, so they were a little confused as to the source of the bleeding. Janet, who had seen the knife, wasn't confused, and she rushed back up to Rachel yelling, "You stabbed her." She then grabbed Rachel by the hair, and Janet pulled her to the ground, yelling again that she had stabbed Sarah, and at that point, according to Janet, Rachel said she didn't care, and she started laughing. That angered Janet, so she dragged Rachel around the yard by her hair. Javier did not hear Rachel say that, but he did see that Janet was dragging her, so he tried to split the two of them up, which he initially succeeded at. But then Janet went for Rachel again, while Rachel said, I'm done, and Janet yelled, "You stabbed my friend." Eventually, Javier got Rachel up to the porch and was in between her and Janet when the police arrived. Rachel stayed on the porch, but everyone else was down by the road. Neighbors started to come out to see what was going on, so this ended up being a bit of a chaotic scene. Sarah was non-responsive but breathing when they arrived. There have been multiple versions about what exactly happened, but it seems like Josh either called his sister or Sarah called him from her phone shortly before she fell unconscious. The last thing he heard from Sarah, whether it was through her phone or his sister's, was, "It hurts." And then his sister told him that Sarah had been stabbed. Josh then ran to Sarah's home and banged on the door, where her parents were waiting for her to come home late from her curfew. He told them that Sarah had been in a fight and directed them to Javier's house. By the time they all got there, the paramedics were there, but Sarah hadn't been taken from the scene yet. Her mother said she just kept yelling, "I love you," to Sarah, but she didn't know if Sarah could hear her before she was loaded into the ambulance and rushed to the hospital. Charlie and Gay, Sarah's parents, went to the hospital and Josh went with them. In spite of the doctor's best efforts, Sarah Ludemann, age 18, was pronounced dead at a little before 2:30 in the morning, less than 2 hours after she pulled up in front of Rachel Wade's car. She had been stabbed twice, with one stab wound penetrating her heart. When Charlie and Gay were allowed to say goodbye, Josh said he didn't want to see her like that. And when they came back out of the room, he was gone. He also did not attend her funeral, but I have the impression he was not exactly invited. As Gay told the Tampa Bay Times, she felt bad for Josh in a way, but they couldn't escape the fact that none of this would have happened if not for him. While the Ludemans were saying their goodbyes to their only child at the hospital, the miracle baby they had waited 15 years for, the police were collecting statements from the witnesses, and 19-year-old Rachel Wade was being interviewed at the police station. She was read her rights, but told she was not at that point under arrest. They just wanted to figure out what happened. And what happened is a question of who you ask. So let's go ahead and start with Rachel's version with a little bit of Javier's in there. According to Rachel, this started well before Sarah's van pulled up in front of Javier's house. She told the two detectives about what was really a pattern of harassment that she said was coming at her from Sarah for several months. She portrayed it, in my opinion, a little more one-sided than I think was the truth. I'll be generous and say that it was her perception that Sarah did more to her than she did to Sarah, but I feel like the back and forth was pretty equal. Rachel said that she had been out walking her dog that evening near her apartment when Sarah drove by, honking at her and yelling at her to stay away from her man. Rachel said it scared her being out after dark with Sarah just driving around. She said she was then inside her apartment when she just kept getting calls from a private number. At first, she ignored them, but she eventually answered thinking maybe it was Josh. But she said it was Sarah, who told her she was waiting outside of her apartment. She then heard honking and shouting. Rachel said she did not feel safe at home alone, so she called a few friends trying to find someone to either come over or looking for a place where she could go for the night. Everyone was busy until she reached out to Javier and asked if she could come over. He was already in bed, but Rachel was sobbing on the phone. She said Josh was cheating again, and she was scared because Janet and Sarah were both threatening to come to her apartment, and she figured she'd be safe at Javier's because they would never think to look for her there. Javier decided to go ahead and get up and hang out with Rachel for the night. He suggested they just wait at his house until some of her friends got off work at Applebee's, and then they could all go out, which would help take her mind off of things. Rachel told the police that she was so worried about an attack by Sarah and/or Janet that she grabbed a steak knife from her kitchen drawer and took it out to the car with her. While Javier was outside his home waiting for Rachel to arrive, his friend Dustin drove by and saw him out there. Dustin decided to stop and say hi, and the two were talking when Rachel got there. She was pretty upset, according to both Javier and Dustin, and she had the knife with her. They both told her she was not going to need it. No one was going to do anything when they were all standing right there. They told Rachel to leave the knife in the car, which both of them thought she did. According to Javier, Rachel's phone would not stop ringing. She would answer it, have a screaming match with whoever was on the other line, and then someone would hang up and the phone would ring again. Dustin and Javier were by Dustin's car in the driveway waiting on Rachel to wrap up whatever this argument was so that they could all get on with their night. The two men were eventually tired of waiting, so Javier walked to the road where Rachel was standing near her car to tell her, "Let's go." At that point, a car was coming down the road slowly at first, but then it sped up and swerved as though it was going to hit Rachel. Javier grabbed her and pulled her into the grass, and the car took off. This had rattled Rachel pretty badly, and it was enough for Rachel to agree it was time to leave. Javier headed to the house to grab his keys when Sarah, Janet, and Jalissa stopped in front of Rachel's car. According to Rachel's version of events, she was sitting on the hood of her car while waiting for Javier. When she saw the minivan, she slid down and stood in the road, taking no more than 2 steps forward. Sarah put the van in park, and all 3 women hopped out. Rachel believed she was being jumped. To warn them off, she took the knife she had with her and held it out to the side a bit. She thought if they could clearly see it, but it wasn't pointed at them, it would be enough to scare them off. But either Sarah didn't see it or it didn't scare her, and according to Rachel, Sarah grabbed her by the hair and pulled her so that her head was down. She was almost bent over. With her free hand, Sarah started hitting her. After 2 or 3 blows to the head, Rachel tried to hit Sarah back, but due to the position, she couldn't see where she was hitting. After a matter of seconds, Sarah just let go of her and walked back to her minivan. Rachel started walking away, only realizing that she had stabbed Sarah when she saw the blood. She said she didn't mean to stab Sarah, she was just trying to hit her to get her to let go and to stop hitting her. Rachel knew that she had to get the knife out of the way before anyone else got hurt, so in between the fighting with Janet, she tried to throw it in the neighbor's backyard, but it ended up landing on their roof. So Rachel was basically saying that she had been harassed consistently for the last 8 to 10 months, threatened that night, and only in fear for her own life did she take a few swings. A few swings with a knife in her hand. But she was saying she acted in self-defense. Now, Florida has a law called the Stand Your Ground Law. At the time this crime happened, the person under threat had no obligation to attempt to retreat first. That requirement had been removed from the law a few years before this. So if you are anywhere you are legally allowed to be, and you are met with force, you can do whatever you think is reasonably necessary to prevent death or bodily harm. The authorities, however, did not see this as quite so clear-cut of a case of self-defense based on the other witness statements, so Rachel was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. So who are our other witnesses? We have Javier and his friend Dustin, and we have Janet and her friend/cousin-in-law Jalissa. Javier backed up Rachel's story that she was terrified that night and in fear for her safety. He said he saw Sarah, without a word, basically charge at Rachel, and the fight was on. He said Sarah was hitting Rachel, and Rachel mostly just looked like she was flailing around. But Javier did have a bias here. He was Rachel's friend, not Sarah's. But beyond that, after Rachel's arrest, he started visiting her in prison. They started talking about what life would look like after she was out of jail if she was given immunity under the self-defense laws. And that included building a life together. Now, I'm not saying Javier was lying or being overly generous to Rachel's version of events because they were dating, but I am saying that he had a reason to lean in her favor. Janet and Jalissa did not back up Rachel's account. Janet said that when they got to Javier's house, she didn't expect there to be a fight. Maybe just the 2 young women yelling at each other, but nothing more than that. And that's in spite of the threats because she had been down this road with them before. It was always drama. The voicemail I played you earlier was from August 2008, 8 months before Sarah was killed. Rachel literally said she was going to murder Sarah, and then nothing happened. Because of this, Janet didn't expect anything to happen this time either. She also said she wouldn't have tried to talk Sarah out of going over there anyway because Sarah had her mind made up to go there and it wouldn't have mattered. Jalissa was in a slightly different boat because she wasn't aware of the back and forth, so she was worried there was going to be a fight. But Sarah was too busy yelling at Rachel on the phone that there wasn't much conversation on the short drive over to Javier's for Jalissa to even try to talk her out of anything. Janet said that Sarah started to get out of the van and got 2 feet on the ground when Rachel came around the open driver's side door to where Sarah was standing. Sarah did not rush Rachel. She did not approach Rachel. Rachel approached her. Jalissa also said that was what happened, and she described the speed at which Rachel approached the minivan as not running, but she was moving faster than just walking. Jalissa said she could not tell who swung first. It all happened in a flash, and for all she knew, Sarah saw the knife and was only raising her arms to defend herself. From her vantage point in the back of the minivan and trying to get out of the van to break up the fight, she didn't see Sarah getting stabbed. And that's pretty much what Janet said too. Sarah was at the driver's side door and hadn't attacked Rachel when Rachel came up to her with the knife. But if I point out Javier's bias, I need to also point it out for Janet and Jalissa. They're not entirely neutral here. Janet did not like Rachel at all, but she did like Sarah. And Jalissa, while not really part of that drama, was a friend and an in-law of Janet's. So maybe she would be more likely to back up Janet's story. Again, I'm not saying they're lying either. I'm just showing everybody's possible bias. We did have one witness here who was as close to unbiased as we can get, and that was Justin. He knew Javier, but he wasn't really connected to anyone else involved. He and Javier had been separated on the night of the incident and questioned separately, and then Dustin didn't see much of Javier afterwards due to his military obligations. So it's not like they had a lot of time to sit there and get a story together. And Dustin includes a detail that hadn't been mentioned by anyone else that I find interesting. Dustin said that after the first car came down the street like it was going to hit Rachel, Rachel asked Javier for directions somewhere. She then left in her car for 5 minutes before returning. When she got back, she said something like, "I'm going to kill that effing bitch." Dustin said he thought the directions given were either to Sarah's house or maybe Josh's or maybe Janet's. He didn't really know because he wasn't familiar with any of them, but he had the impression it had to do with this drama. It was about 10 minutes after Rachel got back that Sarah's van pulled up. This story undermines Rachel's claim that she was waiting in fear at Javier's house and hiding out, and it may point to her either going to Sarah's house to look for her or to Janet's to see if she was still there. As for who approached who first, Dustin kind of split the difference. He said that when the van stopped, Rachel started making her way towards Sarah on the driver's side of the van. But Sarah had gotten fully out of the van, came around the door, and the two met in front of the headlight on the driver's side of Sarah's van. So not right at the driver's door like Jalissa and Janet said, but also not closer to the front middle of Rachel's car like Rachel and Javier said. Like all of the witnesses before, Dustin could not tell who swung first because it just happened too quickly. Even with these contradictory statements, the defense was still going to say this was self-defense. Rachel didn't go find Sarah. Sarah found her. Rachel didn't swing first. According to her, Sarah did. Had Sarah not shown up with two people after having threatened Rachel, none of this would have happened. From the time of the 2005 change in the law that meant that you didn't have a duty to retreat before using deadly force, up to the time of Rachel's arrest, there were 5 cases similar to this where there was a fight, someone died, and the other person claimed self-defense. I didn't find this list myself. I found it on the Defense Help blog compiled by Russo & Russo Law Firm, and it'll be in my sources. But of this list, 2 of the cases had guilty verdicts for manslaughter and 3 had verdicts of not guilty. None of them had a conviction for second-degree murder. But Rachel's attorneys were hoping to not even go to trial. There was a motion to dismiss the charges based on the stand your ground law. Under the law, the judge has to conduct an evidentiary hearing on this type of motion, and that was held on March 30th and March 31st of 2010. If granted, Rachel would be found immune from prosecution due to self-defense. At the immunity hearing, these multiple witnesses testified about what they perceived happened that night, and that included Rachel. In the end, the judge decided that this was not a clear-cut case of stand your ground, so while Rachel could certainly argue that in front of a jury, it was going to have to go to trial. And the trial was held in July of 2010. The prosecution witnesses were obviously the people who witnessed the event, minus Javier. Javier testified for the defense. They also had the medical examiner testify about the force and depth of Sarah's wounds, which made Rachel's story about just flailing around trying to defend herself seem a little bit less likely. The knife was a steak knife that ended up going very deep into Sarah's chest with enough force that the knife blade bent. This would undermine Rachel's own testimony at trial that she was unaware she had stabbed Sarah until she saw the blood and heard Jalissa yelling. She had stabbed her deep enough twice to puncture her lung and heart and bend the knife blade, but she didn't realize she had stabbed her. Josh testified in the trial as well, though I'm not entirely sure what he provided. His testimony was a lot of, I don't know, and I don't remember, and maybe he was just there because surely the jury would want to hear him, put a face to the name, because he was so pivotal to this dynamic. Watching Josh's testimony made me want to go give my own young adult children yet another talk about keeping your standards high when it comes to who you have in your life, because no friend, partner, or spouse will ever be worth acting outside of your character for, and certainly not to this degree. That said, though this case and this trial and even this podcast episode all included Josh's name very frequently, in the end, it wasn't about him. It was about whether Rachel's actions that night were justified. Did Rachel Wade stand her ground near her car, or did she advance on Sarah with a knife? One thing that certainly helped the jurors make up their mind were those voice recordings from 8 months before that Sarah had called the police over. The defense was not successful in getting them suppressed. The messages were Rachel literally saying she was going to murder Sarah. Rachel took the stand in her own defense, which is typical in self-defense cases, and she explained the voicemails by saying that they came after Sarah had already been threatening and harassing her, and she was angry and she thought they would help scare Sarah into leaving her alone. The jury took the case with 3 lines on the verdict form. One was for second-degree murder, the second was for manslaughter, and the third was not guilty. They deliberated for 2.5 hours before checking the line for second-degree murder. At sentencing, Rachel's attorney asked that she be sentenced as a youthful offender, which would mean 15 years in prison and 15 on probation. If sentenced under adult guidelines, it would be more like 21 years to life. The judge had, ahead of sentencing, been given a large number of letters from both Sarah's side and Rachel's. I read several of them as they are public record on the court's website, and they are heartbreaking. So many people's hopes and dreams for these 2 young women were shattered, and it shows just how many people there are left hurting after a murder. Rachel was sentenced on September 3rd, 2010 to 27 years in prison, and in accordance with sentencing rules, she will have to spend 85% of that time behind bars, so we're talking about 23 years. Rachel did appeal, and the biggest basis of this appeal was ineffective assistance of counsel, and in it, she raised 2 key points that I thought were interesting. The first was that the defense did not get Rachel's cell phone records from the night of Sarah's murder. Rachel denied that she had gone to Janet's house and parked down the street threatening Sarah, but her attorney never got her cell phone pings to prove this. The second issue was that Rachel had a few friends who could have testified that Sarah had been the aggressor in the past, but none of them were called to testify in her defense. There was a hearing on this appeal where the people who hadn't testified were able to basically say what their testimony would have been. One person was a coworker named Ashley, not the same one from the night of the incident, and she had been at Applebee's times Sarah would try to sit in Rachel's section at the restaurant and harass her. She said one time when they had karaoke at the bar, Sarah and her friends sang the song Girl Fight by Brooke Valentine, and as they sang, they would point and laugh at Rachel. Ashley had also seen texts Rachel got from Sarah saying to leave Josh alone or she would kick her ass. Ashley was one of the friends who Rachel called scared that night and could back up what Javier said. And when Ashley was asked at the hearing if she was told why she wasn't going to testify at trial, she said that Rachel's attorney just told her that her testimony was more he said, she said than they needed. Another witness called at the hearing was Courtney, who was involved in the Taco Bell parking lot silly string incident. And of course, to decide if this was ineffective assistance of counsel, the attorney Jay Aber had to testify. Testifying at these types of hearings is hard for attorneys who believe their client shouldn't be convicted because they have to defend their work while also still hoping the appeal is somehow won. It's a delicate balance, but all they can do is testify as openly and honestly as possible and let it stand. When it came to not calling a bunch of Rachel's friends to talk about the multi-month lead up to the murder, Jay Aber basically said that it was because they ran some mock trials, and on the whole, all of the background drama did not play well with the mock juries. And sometimes what the friends had to say wouldn't have helped Rachel, like one friend who said she didn't think Rachel was actually that afraid of Sarah. As far as Courtney and the silly string incident went, there was a decent-sized discrepancy in her account and Rachel's. Courtney remembered that Rachel saw Sarah in the car and yelled that they had to go. They got into the car, and then the car pulled in, and they started with the silly string. In Rachel's account, though, she didn't know it was Sarah until they got out of the car. He knew Rachel was going to have to testify, as this was an affirmative defense, and the jury would want to hear from her about how scared for her life she was. Any differences in her testimony from the others would chip away at her credibility, which needed to stay rock solid. And also, think about it. How would it sound to a jury if they tried to present a car getting silly stringed as a pivotal moment in the lead up to a stabbing? It seemed a little out of proportion, and the actual crime that happened, Courtney being punched, happened after Rachel and Courtney had followed the other car, and Sarah was not the one who punched her. Hebert said there was nothing in those witness statements that Rachel couldn't bring up during her own testimony, and just as effectively. There was also the matter of an unnamed witness who had approached Rachel's parents during the trials. She said that she had seen Sarah at Rachel's apartment earlier in the day, which backed up Rachel's story that Sarah had been harassing her that night, and this witness was not followed up on. In the end, the appellate court agreed that the attorney's decisions were trial strategy and not inadequate defense. Rachel has given some prison interviews over the years, and she seems to go back and forth on how she feels. Maybe it's just the editing on these different interviews, but sometimes it sounds like she does think she should be in prison for what she did, but in others, she still says she was being harassed and even bullied by Sarah, which sounds again like she's justifying things. I think the harassment, which went both ways, is like the relationship with Josh. It gives us context for what happened, but it doesn't excuse it on either side. But I'm curious what you think about this case. Did the jury get this right? Was this murder, manslaughter, or self-defense? And what is the moment, the piece of evidence, the witness statement that helps you decide? Now, barring a successful appeal, Rachel Wade is currently scheduled to be released on April 12th, 2032, just 3 days shy of 23 years since Sarah's death. Rachel will be 45 years old, and Sarah Ludemann will forever be 18. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basement4productions.com/support.